the Pepsi accident that changed Michael Jackson forever. In January 1984, Michael Jackson was at the absolute height of his career. Thriller had transformed him from superstar into a global phenomenon, and only weeks after the record-breaking music video premiered, he was filming what should have been another routine Pepsi commercial. Instead, according to the competitor script, the production suddenly became one of the most terrifying moments of his life. As Michael descended a staircase during the performance, pyrotechnics reportedly detonated prematurely. Within seconds, his hair caught fire while cameras continued rolling. The horrifying part was that Michael initially continued moving with the choreography, seemingly unaware of how badly the flames were consuming his scalp. Crew members eventually rushed toward him and extinguished the fire. What happened afterward was far more serious than a few seconds of frightening footage. The source says Michael suffered second and third degree burns to his scalp, requiring emergency treatment before he was transferred to the Brotman Memorial Hospital Burn Center. The accident left lasting damage to his scalp and hair, forcing him to deal with injuries that would follow him for years. For an artist whose appearance was becoming inseparable from his career, the consequences were devastating. His hair became a medical problem rather than simply part of his iconic image, and the source describes him later relying on wigs, hats, and specially constructed hairpieces to conceal the damage. But the accident didn't end when Michael left the hospital. According to the source, doctors later performed extensive procedures on the damaged scalp, including laser surgery and tissue expansion treatments. The burns had destroyed hair follicles, and repeated procedures were reportedly necessary to manage the resulting scarring. The script describes months of painful scalp expansion and tension headaches as Michael underwent treatment after treatment. It also claims that Michael donated his $1, $5 million Pepsi settlement toward establishing a burn center at Brotman Medical Center. And that is why the Pepsi accident became more than a shocking celebrity injury. It became the beginning of a much longer story about pain hidden behind the image. The world continued seeing the glittering gloves, the moonwalk, and the impossible performances. Behind that image, however, Michael was dealing with an injury that would never completely disappear. And the accident was only the beginning. The surgery that couldn't erase Michael's scars. The Pepsi accident lasted only moments. The damage it left behind lasted for years. According to the competitor transcript, the burns destroyed hair follicles across part of Michael Jackson's scalp, leaving permanent scarring and hair loss. In April 1984, Dr. Stephen Hoffman reportedly performed an approximately 80-minute laser procedure on Michael's burned scalp, using a technique described in the source as experimental. Doctors hoped the treatment would repair the damaged area quickly enough for Michael to return to his demanding schedule. But the injury was far more complicated than anyone initially expected. The surgery couldn't simply restore what the fire had destroyed. According to the source, Michael subsequently underwent scalp expansion procedures, in which tissue expanders were placed beneath the scalp and gradually inflated with saline. The purpose was to stretch the remaining healthy tissue so it could cover damaged areas, but the process was described as extremely painful, taking place over several months and producing severe tension headaches. Each procedure was supposed to move Michael closer to repairing the damage, yet the underlying hair follicles that had been destroyed by the burns could not simply be brought back, and this created a problem that the public rarely saw. Michael's hair was one of the most recognizable parts of his image, but the source says that after the accident, he increasingly relied on wigs, hats, and custom hairpieces to conceal the damage. Later, those hairpieces were reportedly specially constructed with breathable mesh and secured carefully because the scarred skin remained extremely sensitive. What looked like a carefully designed hairstyle from the audience's perspective could actually represent another layer of medical management behind the scenes. Perhaps the most unexpected part of the story was what Michael eventually did with the money connected to the accident. According to the source, he donated his reported $1, $5 million Pepsi settlement toward establishing the Michael Jackson Burn Center at Brotman Medical Center. So an accident that permanently changed Michael's appearance also became connected to an effort to help other burn victims. The scars, however, never simply disappeared. The world saw the superstar. Michael had to live with the injury. And, as the years passed, the physical consequences of that accident would become intertwined with another painful part of his life, one involving medication, chronic pain, and a dependency that Michael himself later acknowledged. The painkillers that turned Michael's treatment into a lifelong struggle. The burns from the Pepsi accident were supposed to be a medical crisis Michael would eventually move beyond. But according to the competitor transcript, the treatment introduced another problem that followed him for years: pain medication. Doctors initially prescribed painkillers to deal with the severe pain from his burn injuries and subsequent scalp procedures. The source claims that what began as legitimate medical treatment gradually became dependence, with Michael later acknowledging publicly that his struggle with pain medication had begun with a genuine medical need. By 1993, the problem had become impossible to hide. According to the source, Michael announced that he was leaving the country to undergo treatment for a dependency on pain medication. The The transcript describes a cycle in which powerful medications became increasingly difficult to live without, while the demands of touring, chronic physical pain, and relentless performance pressure made the situation even more complicated. It says Michael entered rehabilitation but later relapsed, portraying the dependency not as a simple personal failure, but as something that had developed around years of physical suffering and medical treatment. The timing made everything even more devastating. Michael was in the middle of the Dangerous World Tour, one of the biggest concert tours on the planet, when his physical condition began affecting his ability to continue. The source describes him collapsing backstage during the tour after suffering severe fluid loss, while later in 1993 he publicly acknowledged his dependence on pain medication and announced his rehabilitation. The remaining tour dates were eventually canceled. What had begun years earlier with an accident during a commercial shoot had now become part of a much larger struggle involving his health, his career, and his ability to perform. But there was another layer to the story. Michael's public image demanded almost superhuman perfection. Audiences expected him to dance, sing, travel, and perform at a level few people could sustain even when completely healthy. The source portrays the chronic pain and medication dependency as part of the hidden burden behind that image. The painful irony was that the same determination that made Michael extraordinary on stage could also make it difficult for him to stop. The fire had injured his body. The treatment had created another battle, and Michael still had years of performing ahead of him. The accident that sent Michael falling 50 feet from the stage. 4 years before Michael Jackson's death, he experienced another accident that could have ended very differently. On June 27, 1999, during a charity concert in Munich, Michael was performing Earth Song when the stage mechanism beneath him suddenly failed. According to the competitor's script, Michael was standing on a bridge above the stage when the structure collapsed, sending him approximately 50 feet down into an orchestra pit. For the audience, it happened in an instant. One moment Michael was performing under the lights. The next, he had disappeared into darkness. What happened next was almost unbelievable. Instead of ending the performance, Michael reportedly climbed out of the orchestra pit and continued Earth Song. The source portrays him as pushing through the accident as though nothing had happened, even though the fall had seriously affected his body. According to the transcript, he suffered damage to his spine, a sprained ankle, nerve shock, and burns on his arms. The performance continued, but once he was finally away from the crowd, the physical consequences became impossible to ignore. The source says Michael collapsed backstage after completing the song. The explanation for the failure made the accident even more disturbing. According to the competitor's script, producer Kenny Ortega later revealed that the mechanism had been assembled using the wrong cable. That meant the spectacular stage effect that was supposed to elevate the performance instead became a potentially fatal trap. Michael reportedly spent several days in hospital afterward and required continuing physical therapy. The source even claims that the spinal injury never properly healed and that Michael later told friends he felt his life flash before his eyes during those terrifying seconds of free fall. Yet the most striking part of the story isn't simply the height of the fall. It's what Michael did immediately afterward. He kept performing. That instinct to finish the show despite an accident that could have left him seriously injured became part of the mythology surrounding Michael Jackson. But it also reveals the darker side of being a performer at his level. The audience saw the spectacle. Michael experienced the impact. And years later, when his body was already carrying the consequences of earlier injuries, surgeries, and chronic pain, another brutal challenge would emerge, trying to prepare for a comeback that demanded more from him than his body could comfortably give. The rehearsal accident that revealed Michael couldn't keep pushing his body. By 2009, Michael Jackson was preparing for what was supposed to be one of the biggest comebacks of his career. This is it. But behind the spectacular costumes, choreography, and massive production plans was a performer whose body had already endured decades of punishment. Years of injuries, painful treatments, and the physical demands of performing had taken their toll. During the final rehearsal period, Michael was still expected to dance, sing, and move with the intensity audiences remembered. The difference was that now every rehearsal came with a much greater physical cost. According to the account surrounding his final rehearsals, Michael's condition became increasingly concerning to people around him. He reportedly struggled with exhaustion and physical discomfort while attempting to maintain the demanding schedule required for the London concerts. Rather than simply performing a few songs, the production required him to rehearse elaborate numbers repeatedly, sometimes for hours. His determination remained enormous, but his body could no longer respond as effortlessly as it had during his younger years. Then came the warning signs that made the situation even more troubling. Michael's rehearsals reportedly showed moments when he appeared physically fragile, requiring people around the production to pay close attention to his condition. Yet he continued working because the comeback meant so much to him. After years away from the concert stage, Michael wanted the final show to prove that he could still deliver the performance everyone expected. The tragedy is that Michael never reached opening night. His final rehearsals became some of the last recorded evidence of him performing, making every movement visible in hindsight feel completely different. What audiences later saw as footage of a legendary performer preparing for his return was actually the closing chapter of his career. The earlier accidents had left physical scars. The years of pain had changed his relationship with his body. And now, at the end of his life, Michael was attempting to push himself one more time. He was preparing for a comeback, but his body was already telling a different story. The final night, when Michael's body finally gave in. On June 24th, 2009, Michael Jackson walked onto the stage for what would become his final rehearsal. He was preparing for This Is It, the comeback that was supposed to return him to London's O2 Arena. Just hours earlier, nobody watching him rehearse could have known that this would be the last time he would perform. The cameras captured Michael moving through the production, singing and dancing as the enormous show around him continued to take shape. From the outside, it looked like the final preparation before a spectacular return. In reality, it was the closing night of his career. Michael had spent decades demanding extraordinary things from his body. The Pepsi accident had left permanent scalp injuries. The Munich stage accident had resulted in another serious physical setback. Years of touring had placed enormous strain on him, and by 2009 he was no longer the young performer who could recover from punishing rehearsals overnight. Yet the final footage showed him continuing to work because the comeback mattered deeply to him. After that final rehearsal, Michael returned home. According to the established account of his final hours, he was under the care of Dr. Conrad Murray, who had been hired to help manage his health and sleep while he prepared for the concerts. In the early morning of June 25th, Murray administered medications to Michael, including propofol, a powerful anesthetic. Michael was eventually found unresponsive in his bedroom, and emergency efforts began. The devastating irony is impossible to ignore. Michael had just completed what became his final performance. He had spent the evening rehearsing the songs and choreography that millions of fans were waiting to see live. Instead of opening the London concerts, those rehearsal recordings would become the final visual record of Michael Jackson performing. And suddenly, the story of his accidents, injuries, pain, and relentless determination came to an end, not on a massive concert stage in London, but in his own home the following day. The comeback never happened. The final rehearsal became the farewell. The doctor who was there during Michael's final hours. During Michael Jackson's final hours, one person was supposed to be watching over him. Dr. Conrad Murray, the physician hired to provide medical care while Michael prepared for his London concerts. On the night of June 24, 2009, Michael returned home after his final rehearsal for This Is It. What happened inside that house would soon become the subject of a major criminal investigation, and ultimately one of the most scrutinized chapters in Michael Jackson's entire life. According to the established account of that morning, Murray was providing Michael with medications intended to help him sleep. Michael had reportedly been struggling with insomnia while preparing for the physically demanding concert schedule. Murray eventually administered propofol, a powerful anesthetic that is normally used in carefully controlled medical settings. At some point afterward, Murray noticed that Michael was no longer breathing normally and could not be awakened. He attempted to respond to the emergency, and eventually emergency medical personnel were called to the house. What followed was a desperate attempt to revive Michael. Paramedics performed CPR and continued emergency treatment before transporting him to Ronald Reagan UCLA Medical Center. Despite those efforts, Michael was pronounced dead on June 25, 2009, at the age of 50. The announcement transformed what had begun as a planned concert comeback into one of the most shocking deaths in modern entertainment history. But Murray's role didn't end with that tragic morning. The circumstances surrounding Michael's treatment immediately raised questions about the medications he had been given, the level of monitoring involved, and whether the medical care provided had been appropriate. Those questions eventually became the center of a criminal case against Murray. In 2011, Murray was convicted of involuntary manslaughter in connection with Michael's death and was sentenced to prison. The case permanently changed the way the public understood those final hours. Michael had spent the previous evening rehearsing for millions of fans. By the next day, the comeback was over, and the doctor who was supposed to protect him was at the center of the investigation into how he died. The medical mistake that changed the story of Michael's death. For years, Michael Jackson's death was discussed as a mysterious tragedy, but the investigation eventually focused on something much more specific: how the medical care in his bedroom was handled during those final hours. Michael was being treated by Dr. Conrad Murray while preparing for his comeback, and the central issue became his use of propofol, a powerful anesthetic that Murray had been administering to help Michael sleep. The medication itself was not the only question. Investigators examined the circumstances in which it was given and the level of monitoring Michael received afterward. The crucial issue was that propofol can profoundly suppress breathing and requires careful medical supervision. According to the prosecution's case, Murray failed to provide the level of monitoring and emergency preparedness that Michael's condition required. When Murray realized that Michael was not breathing normally, The situation had already become a medical emergency. CPR was attempted and emergency responders were eventually called, but efforts to revive Michael failed. The investigation then uncovered a much larger problem. Rather than treating Michael's final hours as an isolated medical emergency, prosecutors argued that the events reflected a pattern of unsafe medical decisions. The case ultimately focused on Murray's actions before, during, and after administering the drug. In November 2011, a Los Angeles jury found Murray guilty of involuntary manslaughter. He was later sentenced to 4 years in prison, though he served roughly half of that sentence before being released in 2013. That conviction changed the public understanding of Michael's death. The story was no longer simply about a superstar whose health had deteriorated after decades of physical strain. It became a story about a specific medical relationship, a powerful drug, and decisions made during the final hours of Michael's life. And perhaps the most haunting detail is that Michael had been working toward a completely different ending. He wasn't preparing to disappear. He was preparing to return to the stage. The world was waiting for Michael Jackson's comeback. Instead, the medical decisions made that night became part of the final chapter of his life. The accident that Michael's body could never fully recover from. Of all the accidents Michael Jackson experienced during his career, one stood out because it happened on stage in front of thousands of people, while Michael was performing one of his most demanding productions. During the 1999 Earth Song performance in Munich, a stage mechanism malfunctioned beneath Michael and he fell into the orchestra pit. The incident was terrifying, but what made it even more remarkable was what Michael did afterward. Instead of immediately ending their performance, he climbed back onto the stage and continued the song. According to the source material, the fall caused significant physical injuries, including problems involving Michael's spine and ankle, along with other injuries sustained during the accident. The performance itself became almost surreal. Michael had just experienced a dangerous fall, yet the audience watched him continue performing. Only afterward did the seriousness of the incident become clearer. The source describes Michael collapsing backstage and requiring medical treatment following the performance. What made the accident especially important in the larger story of Michael's life was the timing. By this point, his body had already endured years of intense touring, choreography, injuries, and medical procedures. The Munich accident added another major physical setback to a career that had demanded extraordinary endurance from him. Even when Michael appeared almost weightless on stage, there was a physical price behind those movements. And that pattern would continue. Michael repeatedly pushed through pain because performing was central to who he was. He didn't want audiences to see weakness. He wanted them to see the finished performance, the perfect choreography, the powerful vocals, and the spectacle. But by the time he began preparing for This Is It in 2009, the accumulated history of injuries had become impossible to separate from the performer himself. The accidents were over in seconds. Their consequences stayed with Michael for years. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part is that, despite everything his body had endured, Michael was still determined to perform one final time. The accident that Michael's body could never fully recover from. Of all the accidents Michael Jackson experienced during his career, one stood out because it happened on stage in front of thousands of people, while Michael was performing one of his most demanding productions. During the 1999 Earth Song performance in Munich, a stage mechanism malfunctioned beneath Michael and he fell into the orchestra pit. The incident was terrifying, but what made it even more remarkable was what Michael did afterward. Instead of immediately ending their performance, he climbed back onto the stage and continued the song. According to the source material, the fall caused significant physical injuries, including problems involving Michael's spine and ankle, along with other injuries sustained during the accident. The performance itself became almost surreal. Michael had just experienced a dangerous fall, yet the audience watched him continue performing. Only afterward did the seriousness of the incident become clearer. The source describes Michael collapsing backstage and requiring medical treatment following the performance. What made the accident especially important in the larger story of Michael's life was the timing. By this point, his body had already endured years of intense touring, choreography, injuries, and medical procedures. The Munich accident added another major physical setback to a career that had demanded extraordinary endurance from him. Even when Michael appeared almost weightless on stage, there was a physical price behind those movements. And that pattern would continue. Michael repeatedly pushed through pain because performing was central to who he was. He didn't want audiences to see weakness. He wanted them to see the finished performance, the perfect choreography, the powerful vocals, and the spectacle. But by the time he began preparing for This Is It in 2009, the accumulated history of injuries had become impossible to separate from the performer himself. The accidents were over in seconds. Their consequences stayed with Michael for years. And perhaps the most heartbreaking part is that, despite everything his body had endured, Michael was still determined to perform one final time. The accident that became Michael Jackson's final warning. Looking back at Michael Jackson's life, the accidents seem almost like separate chapters, but together they tell a much darker story. The 1984 Pepsi fire left him with severe scalp burns and permanent damage. Years later, the 1999 Munich stage accident sent him falling into an orchestra pit during Earth Song. Each time, Michael did something extraordinary. He recovered, returned to work, and continued performing. But the injuries didn't simply disappear. They became part of the physical history he carried into the final years of his life. The most striking thing about Michael was his refusal to let pain define what audiences saw. Even after serious injuries, he continued rehearsing, touring, and performing at a level that demanded enormous physical effort. The competitor's story repeatedly presents this determination as one of Michael's defining characteristics. But by the time he began preparing for This Is It, there was a crucial difference. Michael was no longer recovering from one isolated accident. He was carrying the accumulated consequences of decades of physical strain. Then came his final rehearsal on June 24th, 2009. Michael performed the songs and choreography for the concert that was supposed to mark his return to the stage. The footage later became This Is It, turning what was intended to be preparation for a new beginning into a record of his final performance work. The following day, Michael died at age 50 after a cardiac arrest at his Los Angeles home. His personal physician, Conrad Murray, was later convicted of involuntary manslaughter in connection with his death. So was one accident responsible for Michael Jackson's death? No. The story is more complicated than that. His earlier injuries, medical treatment, chronic pain, and final medical circumstances belong to different chapters and should not be presented as one direct chain of causation. What the accidents do reveal, however, is the extraordinary physical price Michael paid for a career built around perfection. The Pepsi flames didn't stop him. The Munich fall didn't stop him. Pain didn't stop him. Michael kept going until the very end. And that may be the most haunting lesson of all. Sometimes the greatest danger wasn't the accident itself. It was how determined Michael was to keep performing afterward. End of documentary. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this story, like the video, subscribe, and turn on notifications for more rare Michael Jackson stories, forgotten moments, and behind-the-scenes chapters from his extraordinary life. Michael Jackson may have left the stage, but the stories behind it are still being discovered.